The Hidden Test. The Mitchell estate stood like a monument to wealth on the outskirts of the city, its marble walls catching the last rays of the evening sun. Inside the vast study, billionaire Alexander Grant sat slouched in his leather recliner, the golden light from a single desk lamp painting shadows across the room. His breathing was calm, slow, deliberate. To anyone walking in, it would look as though he had drifted into an afternoon nap, the kind of rest only a man of power could afford. But Alexander was not resting. His eyes were closed only halfway, his mind sharply awake. This evening was not ordinary. It was the night he had chosen to test something more important than profit margins, more important than stock market gains. Tonight, he wanted to test the heart of another human being. It had been years since Alexander trusted anyone fully. His empire had been built through grit and ambition, but it had also been scarred by betrayal. A former partner had once siphoned millions behind his back. An advisor he once considered family had lied to him for years. He had learned to measure people not by their smiles or their words, but by the decisions they made when no one was watching. In Alexander's mind, character revealed itself in silence, in solitude, when temptation was closest. And so, after weeks of reflection, he had devised this test. He had left the safe door wide open, deliberately careless, exposing thick stacks of crisp bills. Beside them lay a sleek gold pen worth more than most cars. The message was clear. Here was temptation within arm's reach. Here was the chance to claim what was not theirs. The billionaire's plan was simple. He would pretend to sleep in his study while the night cleaning staff came in, particularly one woman who had been on his mind. Her name was Ruth Carter, a quiet and diligent maid who had worked in his mansion for over 3 years. Ruth was a widow, raising her only son alone. She never asked for help, never complained, never lingered where she wasn't needed. She moved through the halls like a whisper, always respectful, always efficient. But Alexander had noticed her more than she realized. He had seen the boy waiting quietly in the corner as she worked, his small hands sometimes helping her wipe down surfaces or arrange books. Alexander had watched from a distance as Ruth reminded her son again and again, "What is not yours must remain untouched. Respect brings honor, even when no one sees you." And yet, tonight was different. Tonight Alexander wanted to see if her son lived by those words, or if innocence could be swayed by the glitter of wealth. The boy, no older than 8, was still young enough to be molded, but old enough to understand right from wrong. Alexander wanted to know, would this child reach for the money, or would he walk away? Would the values his mother taught him stand against temptation? The billionaire believed he was staging a test for the boy, but in truth, it was a test for himself as well, whether he still believed integrity existed in a world that had so often disappointed him. The tall grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, each second echoing in the dim light. Alexander lowered his head slightly, adjusting his posture into the perfect disguise of sleep. He forced his breaths to come slower, steadier, as the faint sound of a rolling cart came from down the hall. The door creaked softly, and Ruth stepped into the study. Her uniform was pressed, though worn from years of use, and her tired eyes carried the weight of someone who worked too much yet never complained. At her side, holding a small notebook and wearing a pair of hand-me-down gloves that were too large for his fingers, was her son, Ethan. "Good evening, sir," Ruth whispered, glancing toward the recliner. Seeing her employer asleep, she lowered her head respectfully and guided the cart inside. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to being unseen, careful not to disturb the man she thought was resting. Ethan, however, was not looking at the billionaire. His young eyes roamed the massive study, curious about the shelves lined with rare books, the glint of polished wood, and the large safe standing against the wall. The safe door was open just enough for the golden light to spill onto the floor, and inside, stacks of bills sat like towers waiting to be noticed. From beneath his lashes, Alexander saw it, the precise moment when Ethan's gaze landed on the money. His heartbeat quickened, though he gave no sign of wakefulness. Here it was, the crux of his test. Would the boy rush forward in childish greed? Would he pocket a bill when his mother's back was turned, or would he at least hesitate, tempted by the shimmer of easy wealth? The billionaire, though hardened by years of betrayal, still longed for hope, and in this moment he held his breath as if his entire empire depended on the boy's choice. Ethan walked slowly toward the safe, his small steps echoing softly against the marble floor. Ruth was busy dusting the shelves, her back turned. The boy reached the edge of the safe and stopped. He stared at the piles of money, his brow furrowing not with hunger but with puzzlement. Then, to Alexander's astonishment, Ethan crouched down and began carefully adjusting the stacks. With small, deliberate movements, he straightened the bundles, lining them neatly, arranging the denominations in order as though tidying something precious. His lips moved as he spoke softly to himself. "Mom always says things should be neat, even if they don't belong to us," the boy whispered, almost inaudible, yet clear enough to pierce Alexander's heart. At that moment, Ruth turned and saw her son near the safe. Her eyes widened in alarm. "Ethan," she hissed in a whisper, "don't touch Mr. Grant's things." The boy looked up, innocence radiating from his face. "I wasn't taking, Mama. It was messy. I just wanted to fix it. He won't like it messy." He pulled his hands back instantly, clasping them behind his back as though to prove he had taken nothing. His little gloves, too big for his fingers, trembled slightly. Ruth hurried forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Remember what I told you, child. Other people's belongings are sacred. You don't touch them, not even to fix them." "Yes, Mama," Ethan said softly, lowering his head. But even as he stepped back, his eyes lingered on the safe, not with desire, but with a strange sense of guardianship, as though he wanted to protect something valuable simply by keeping it in order. Alexander felt a rush in his chest, a surge of warmth he had not known in years. The boy had not reached for greed, had not even shown envy. Instead, he had shown discipline, order, and a quiet respect far beyond his years. It wasn't an act. It was instinct, as natural as breathing. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something stir inside him, the faint but undeniable pulse of hope. Ruth guided her son back to the corner of the study, where he pulled out his notebook and began scribbling numbers as though practicing math. She returned to her work, polishing surfaces with careful diligence. Ethan, from time to time, glanced at the safe, not with longing, but with the serious look of a small guardian keeping watch. And Alexander, though still pretending to sleep, found his carefully staged test crumbling under the weight of what he had witnessed. When they finished their duties and quietly left the room, the billionaire slowly opened his eyes. He rose from the recliner, walked to the safe, and stared at the stacks of money. They were perfectly aligned, cleaner than before, touched not by greed but by honesty. He closed the safe door and turned the lock, the click echoing in the silence like a promise. For years he had believed integrity was rare, almost extinct in a world driven by ambition. But tonight, in the small act of a boy who chose order over greed, Alexander Grant had seen something far greater than wealth. He had seen proof that character still existed, that dignity could be taught and lived even in the humblest corners of life. And for the first time in decades, the billionaire froze, not in suspicion, not in disappointment, but in awe. He whispered to himself, "Perhaps the richest treasure isn't in the safe after all." The quiet strength. The night after the test, Alexander Grant did not sleep easily. He lay awake in the vast silence of his penthouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the city lights bled through the curtains. His mind was not occupied by stock reports, contracts, or the empire he had built. It was occupied by a boy's simple gesture, straightening stacks of bills not to steal but to keep them neat. It should have been an ordinary act, small and insignificant. Yet to Alexander, it was as if the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis. For years he had lived behind walls of suspicion, convinced that greed lived in everyone, that trust was a weakness, that betrayal was inevitable. But now, against all logic, one child's instinct had cracked the armor he had built around his heart. He replayed the scene in his head again and again. The boy's words echoed like a hymn. "It was messy. I just wanted to fix it." That phrase carried a purity no boardroom speech could replicate. It was not rehearsed, not performed for recognition. It was real. And reality, Alexander realized, was something he had been starving for. The next morning, instead of heading straight into his meetings, he lingered in his office and pulled up the security footage from the previous evening. He watched the scene with meticulous care, the maid entering quietly, the boy glancing around, the approach toward the safe. He slowed the footage, noting the hesitation that never turned into greed, the instinctive order, the respect the boy showed even when his mother corrected him. Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. It wasn't the act of not stealing that struck him. It was the fact that the boy never even seemed tempted. That was rarer than gold in Alexander's world. From that moment forward, Alexander began to observe Ruth Carter and her son in ways he hadn't before. He instructed his security team to preserve more footage from their shifts. He did not want to expose or embarrass them. He simply wanted to understand. Each evening, he would quietly review clips of their presence in his mansion. He watched Ruth move with tireless diligence, cleaning rooms with quiet efficiency, humming softly to herself as she polished wood and dusted shelves. He watched her son, Ethan, sit patiently in corners, doing his homework under dim light, occasionally helping his mother with small tasks. What fascinated Alexander was the rhythm between them, the way Ruth used each moment as a lesson for her son. "Wipe every surface, even the hidden ones," she told him once, as she handed him a cloth. "Integrity is not about what others see, it's about what you know you've done." Another night, Ethan accidentally knocked over a vase and quickly picked it up, panicking. Ruth knelt down beside him and whispered, "We admit mistakes. That's strength, not weakness." Each phrase, each correction, revealed a mother passing down not just rules, but principles, shaping her son into someone who understood that values mattered more than circumstances. Alexander found himself riveted, as though these ordinary moments contained the kind of wisdom he had overlooked in his own rise to power. During the day, Alexander carried on as usual, negotiating with partners, chairing meetings, signing contracts. To his executives and employees, he was still the same billionaire they knew, sharp, calculating, impossible to deceive. Yet inside, something had begun to shift. For years he had thought wealth insulated him from truth, that honesty was a luxury only the naive could afford. But now he found himself questioning everything. Could it be that in all his obsession with control, he had missed the simple strength of those who lived with nothing yet carried themselves with dignity? It wasn't long before Alexander began to notice how others within his company treated Ruth. In one board meeting, a vice president skimmed over a report mentioning a slight increase in janitorial wages. "Unnecessary spending," the man muttered. "People like that should be grateful they have jobs at all." The casual cruelty of the remark struck Alexander like a slap. He had heard similar sentiments before, but this time it felt personal. He thought of Ethan's small hands straightening his money without taking a single bill. He thought of Ruth teaching her son that mistakes were admitted, not hidden. And suddenly, dismissive comments about people like them felt intolerable. That evening, when Ruth and Ethan returned for their shift, Alexander watched more closely than ever. He noticed the way Ethan greeted the portraits on the walls with a little bow, mimicking his mother's gesture of respect for the house they served. He noticed how Ruth, though exhausted from working multiple jobs, never let bitterness slip into her voice when she spoke to her son. Instead, she filled his mind with reminders. Every job has dignity. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. Alexander felt his throat tighten as he watched. Here was a woman who carried herself with more quiet strength than most of the executives he paid millions. And here was a boy absorbing her values like a sponge, becoming a living example of something Alexander himself had long forgotten: honor without reward. But the billionaire also knew the world was not kind to people like them. He had built his empire in boardrooms filled with ruthless voices, men who measured worth by profit alone, who laughed at the idea of principles when money was at stake. And he knew it was only a matter of time before someone else noticed the pay increase Ruth had quietly been given, or before someone questioned why her son accompanied her to shifts. Prejudice, Alexander knew, had a way of seeping through walls, no matter how strong. One night, after Ruth and Ethan left, Alexander stayed late in his study, staring at the closed safe. He thought of his own childhood, of growing up in a home where his father measured love in achievements, where weakness was mocked, and where mistakes were punished instead of corrected. He remembered the loneliness of realizing that trust was conditional, that affection had to be earned by proving himself useful. In some ways, he realized, he had become a mirror of that upbringing, suspicious, guarded, unwilling to believe in others. But Ethan's innocence had cracked that mirror. For the first time in years, Alexander wondered if trust could be rebuilt, not through contracts and lawyers, but through small acts of integrity. He found himself asking questions he had never allowed himself before. What if he created a company where dignity mattered as much as profit? What if he built systems that rewarded honesty, not just ambition? And most unsettling of all, what if the lessons he had ignored all his life were sitting right in front of him, spoken not by millionaires, but by a maid and her child? As these thoughts gnawed at him, Alexander began to take subtle actions. He instructed HR to quietly adjust Ruth's pay upward again, coding it as a routine performance raise. He ensured Ethan's presence during her shifts was formally documented as an exception allowed by him personally, shielding them from unnecessary scrutiny. He even arranged for a scholarship fund under a generic foundation name, ensuring that when Ethan was older, his education would never be hindered by financial struggle. Yet Alexander did not announce any of this. He did not want gratitude or attention. He wanted dignity preserved. He knew Ruth would feel humiliated if her life was turned into a public gesture. Instead, he chose to protect them silently, just as they had lived silently in his mansion's corners for years. Still, change rarely comes without resistance. Within weeks, whispers began to circulate in the executive halls. Some wondered why a cleaning woman was suddenly being paid more. Others made thinly veiled remarks about favoritism. And it was only a matter of time before one voice rose louder than the rest. Richard Blackwell, Alexander's ambitious vice president. Richard was sharp, confident, and cruelly pragmatic. To him, employees like Ruth were expendable, tools to be replaced if they cost too much. When he noticed at her raise, his lips curled into a smirk. "Interesting," he muttered. "Our billionaire seems sentimental these days." Alexander, however, was unmoved. He had seen something Richard never would. A boy who valued honesty over greed, a mother who taught dignity despite hardship, and quietly, deep in his heart, Alexander knew the real test had only just begun. The clash of worlds, the transformation within Alexander Grant's heart was invisible to most, but in the undercurrents of his company, the ripples had already begun. His executives, sharp-eyed and attuned to the language of numbers, noticed the smallest anomalies: a slight raise in janitorial wages, a file marked with exceptions, a scholarship fund quietly approved under an anonymous foundation. These were not figures large enough to alarm shareholders, but within the walls of Grant Enterprises, every detail carried weight. And when details began to diverge from the cold efficiency the company was known for, whispers inevitably followed. At first, the whispers were harmless. A few assistants murmuring in corridors, curious why the cleaning woman's pay had shifted upward on the reports. But soon the murmurs reached the boardroom, where men and women sat with polished shoes and sharper tongues. It was there, amid the gleam of glass and steel, that Richard Blackwell made his presence felt. Richard was the kind of man who thrived on power plays. His family had been intertwined with the company since its founding, their wealth and influence stretching back decades. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair combed immaculately and a suit pressed to perfection, he carried himself as though he already owned half the empire. For years he had been patient, watching Alexander climb to the pinnacle, waiting for the moment when weakness would reveal itself. And now, he thought he saw it. In the quarterly review meeting, as spreadsheets flashed across the screens, Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping a polished pen against the table. "Alexander," he drawled, his voice smooth as silk yet edged with condescension, "I've noticed an unusual increase in operational costs, specifically in the janitorial division. One individual seems to have received not one, but 2 raises within a span of months. Care to explain?" The room went still. Executives glanced at one another, sensing the tension. Alexander's eyes, calm but unblinking, met Richard's across the table. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, like 2 predators circling the same prey. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Ruth Carter has shown consistent performance," he said simply, his tone even. "Her work is thorough, her reliability unquestioned. Compensation has been adjusted accordingly." Richard's lips curled into a thin smile. "Consistent performance," he repeated, as if savoring the words. "Alexander, with all due respect, janitors do not build empires. They sweep floors, they empty trash. To reward them disproportionately is sentimental." He let the last word hang in the air like a stain, his eyes glinting with challenge. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. They were accustomed to Richard's bluntness, but there was something sharper in his tone now, a barely veiled accusation that Alexander, the man they had always seen as ruthless and pragmatic, was softening. Alexander did not rise to the bait. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Empires fall not because of enemies outside, but because of rot within," he said quietly. "If we cannot value dignity at every level, then this company is worth nothing." The room fell silent. Some executives looked impressed, others skeptical. Richard, however, masked his irritation with a smooth chuckle. "Of course, dignity has its place. But let us not forget the hierarchy that keeps order." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Not everyone can be elevated, Alexander. Some are meant to remain invisible." Invisible. The word struck Alexander like an ember. He remembered that night in the study, when Ruth's son Ethan had straightened the stacks of money and then sat in the corner, quietly watching over them as though guarding something sacred. Invisible? No. That boy had shown more strength in a single instinct than most men in this room had in their entire careers. Alexander said nothing, but his silence was not weakness. It was the sharpening of a blade. Later that evening, Ruth pushed her cleaning cart through the quiet marble corridors of the headquarters. Ethan walked beside her, carrying his small notebook, scribbling numbers and sketches with the seriousness of a child who wanted to grow beyond his circumstances. To them, the building was a second home, though not by choice. Ruth worked 2 jobs, and evenings at Grant Enterprises often meant Ethan had to accompany her, quietly doing homework while she polished floors and dusted shelves. As she bent to pick up a discarded coffee cup outside the conference room, she felt a shadow fall across her path. She straightened and found herself face to face with Richard Blackwell. His presence filled the hallway like an unwelcome draft, his smile sharp, his eyes cold. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, blocking the cart with one hand, "I've been hearing interesting things about you." Ruth straightened her shoulders, offering the polite nod she gave all superiors. "Good evening, sir. Is there something I can assist you with?" Richard's smile tightened. "Yes, you can assist me by understanding your place. I know about your recent raises. I know about your special treatment. Don't think it's gone unnoticed." Ruth's heart skipped, but she kept her calm. "Posure. I only do my job, sir. Nothing more, nothing less." Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't play modest. People like you should know better than to attract attention. You clean floors. That's it. Don't bring your son here as though this is some daycare, and don't imagine for a second that you belong anywhere beyond the shadows." Ethan, who had been standing quietly with his notebook, clenched his small fists inside his worn gloves. His young face flushed with anger, But before he could speak, his mother placed a steady hand on his shoulder. She met Richard's gaze without flinching. "My son has as much right to learn in these halls as anyone's child," she said firmly, "and I will never teach him that his place is in the shadows. Respect is not given by title, it's earned." Richard's eyes narrowed, his smile vanishing. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing the disdain underneath. "Careful, Mrs. Carter," he said coldly. "You wouldn't want your position to vanish overnight." With that, he stepped aside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he disappeared down the corridor. Ruth exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She turned to Ethan, who looked up at her with a mixture of confusion and defiance. "Why does he talk to you like that, Mama?" the boy asked. She knelt down, smoothing his hair. "Because some people think power makes them better than others. But remember this, Ethan. No one decides your worth but you. We don't answer arrogance with anger. We answer it by living with honor." What neither of them realized was that upstairs, in his private office, Alexander Grant had seen everything. The cameras lining the hallway had captured Richard's every word, his every sneer. And as Alexander replayed the footage, something in him hardened. This was no longer just about Ruth or her son. This was about the soul of his company. If men like Richard believed employees could be dismissed as invisible, then the empire he had built was already rotting from within. That night, Alexander picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice on the other end answered, deep and steady, Alexander spoke without hesitation. "Marcus, it's Alexander. I need you. This is about abuse of power. The name is Richard Blackwell." Marcus Chen, a former investigator with a reputation for uncovering corruption, paused for a beat. Then his reply came, calm and precise. "Understood. I'll need everything. Records, footage, testimonies. If he's as arrogant as you say, he'll have left traces. But remember, Alexander, if we start this, there's no going back." Alexander's voice was firm. "Good. Then let's not go back. Let's go forward." For the first time in years, he felt alive, not from profit margins or acquisitions, but from the conviction that he was about to fight for something greater than himself. He had frozen once at a boy's honesty. Now he was ready to move, not as a billionaire protecting his empire, but as a man reclaiming its soul. Seeds of change. The days that followed Richard Blackwell's confrontation with Ruth Carter unfolded with a quiet but undeniable weight, like storm clouds gathering on a horizon that only a few could see. To most employees at Grant Enterprises, the rhythms of business continued as usual. Reports filed, contracts signed, meetings stretched long into the evening. But beneath the polished surface, subtle tensions crackled. Ruth could feel it in the way some assistants avoided her gaze, the way her cart seemed to draw unwanted attention whenever she pushed it through the gleaming hallways. She did not need anyone to tell her that whispers were being spread. She had lived long enough to recognize the sting of prejudice disguised as curiosity. For Ethan, however, the company headquarters remained a place of fascination. He would sit quietly in corners with his notebooks, scribbling numbers, sketching diagrams of machines he imagined, and listening with wide-eyed curiosity to fragments of conversations that floated out of conference rooms. He asked questions constantly: why the building had so many lights burning late into the night, why grown men in suits always looked tired, why money mattered so much if it made people so unhappy. Ruth would smile and hush him, but she never silenced his curiosity. Instead, she told him, "Learn from what you see, Ethan. Even shadows teach lessons." Alexander Grant, from the privacy of his office, was watching, not just through screens and cameras, but with the eyes of a man who had rediscovered something worth believing in. Night after night, he reviewed the footage of Ruth and Ethan's shifts. He watched as Ethan carefully stacked discarded papers into neat piles, as Ruth whispered small lessons about respect and discipline while they cleaned, as the boy once again adjusted a crooked painting in the hallway, not for praise, but because he could not bear to leave something disorderly. To Alexander, these details were like oxygen to a suffocating man. He had spent years breathing the stale air of cynicism, convinced that integrity was extinct in a world of greed. But here, in the simplest acts of a boy and his mother, he saw integrity lived out again and again, unpolished, unpretentious, unshaken by circumstance. Each night reinforced the truth he had begun to glimpse the evening he staged his test. Character did not need wealth to shine. Yet Alexander was not naive. He knew that Richard Blackwell was circling like a hawk. Richard's words in the boardroom, his sneer in the hallway, were not empty. He had power, influence, and a ruthless instinct for destroying obstacles, and bond. To Richard, Ruth Carter and her son were not just obstacles, they were symbols of something that threatened his control. That was why Alexander had called Marcus Chen. Marcus was a man who had once dismantled criminal syndicates with surgical precision, a man whose investigative skills were feared by those who had something to hide. Now, sitting across from Alexander in the private study of the mansion, Marcus reviewed the first batch of security footage Alexander had provided. "Interesting," Marcus murmured, rewinding the clip of Richard confronting Ruth. "Notice the body language. He's not just exercising authority, he's enjoying it. Men like this leave trails, Alexander. Arrogance always does. Give me time, and I'll find them." Alexander leaned forward, his jaw tight. "I don't just want dirt, Marcus. I want the truth. If I fight him, it must be with evidence no one can dismiss." Marcus nodded. "Then truth is what you'll get. But be prepared. Truth cuts both ways. When we expose Richard, it won't just bruise him. It will shake the foundation of your company. Some will call you reckless for siding with a janitor over your own vice president." Alexander's gaze hardened. "Then let them call me reckless. I'd rather rebuild on honesty than continue on rot." As Marcus set to work, combing through financial records, correspondence logs, and archived surveillance, Alexander continued to watch Ruth and Ethan. One evening, he saw something that struck him deeply. Ruth was wiping down the glass wall of a conference room, while Ethan sat nearby, working on his math problems. After a long silence, the boy looked up and asked, "Mama, why do we have to clean other people's things? Why can't we have our own building someday?" Ruth paused, her cloth still in her hand. She turned to her son with a soft smile. "Ethan, listen to me. There is no shame in cleaning. Work is never small when you do it with dignity. But if you dream of your own building, then study harder than anyone else. Learn from every hallway you walk, every corner you polish. One day, you'll use what you learn to build something better. That's how we rise, not by stealing, but by working with honor." Alexander felt his throat tighten as he heard her words. He thought of the empire he had built, of the sacrifices he had made, of the trust he had lost. And he wondered, had he ever taught anyone values that would outlive him? He had trained leaders, yes, but had he ever inspired integrity? Watching Ruth teach her son by example, he realized that true legacy was not in balance sheets, but in principles carried forward. Meanwhile, Richard's pressure began to mount. Ruth started receiving sudden inspections from supervisors who nitpicked her work. Supplies for her cleaning cart were delayed, forcing her to improvise. Whispers grew louder in the cafeteria, where she overheard fragments of sentences: special treatment, favoritism, doesn't belong here. Yet through it all, she never let her composure crack. She worked with the same steady hands, the same quiet grace. And Ethan, watching his mother endure without bitterness, learned lessons more powerful than any textbook could teach. One night, as Ruth and Ethan entered the executive lounge to tidy up, they found a wallet on the floor. It was thick, clearly belonging to one of the high-ranking staff, with bills spilling slightly from the edges. Ethan picked it up carefully and handed it to his mother. "Mama, look, someone dropped this." Ruth opened the wallet just enough to see the identification inside. It belonged to one of the senior managers. She closed it immediately and had placed it on the counter where the owner would surely see it. Ethan frowned. "Shouldn't we give it to someone? What if they think we took it?" Ruth knelt down, looking her son in the eye. "The truth will defend us, Ethan. If they ask, we tell them we left it where it was safest. What matters is that we never let temptation decide our actions." From his hidden vantage point, Alexander froze once again. He had not staged this moment. There was no test, no trap, and yet once again, Ethan and Ruth had chosen integrity without hesitation. It was no longer about proving themselves to anyone. It was simply who they were. Later that night, Alexander sent a short message to Marcus. "Whatever you find, hurry. This is no longer about protecting them. It's about protecting what they represent." Marcus replied within minutes. "Understood. And you'll be interested to know, your vice president has left quite a paper trail." As Alexander read those words, he knew the storm was no longer distant. It was here, gathering strength, and soon choices would have to be made, not just for Ruth and her son, but for the future of everything he had built. The storm breaks. The tension inside Grant Enterprises was no longer a whisper. It had become a current everyone could feel. Employees walked the halls with tightened shoulders, speaking more carefully than usual, as though the walls themselves had begun listening. Rumors swirled in quiet corners, about the cleaning woman who somehow earned raises, about the boy who wandered the building with a notebook, about the billionaire who seemed strangely invested in their presence. Most of the rumors carried disdain, others curiosity, but all of them had a single origin: Richard Blackwell. Richard had never been a man who tolerated being overlooked, and in the weeks following his confrontation with Ruth Carter, his irritation had grown into a strategy. He had influence, connections, and a reputation for making problems disappear. Ruth, to him, was no more than a symbol, a reminder that Alexander Grant's judgment was slipping, that the unbreakable billionaire was softening, and Richard knew how to weaponize such symbols. One evening, as Ruth was polishing the long marble counter in the executive lounge, two junior employees entered, whispering and laughing. They paused when they saw her, exchanged glances, and then deliberately dropped a stack of papers onto the freshly cleaned surface, scattering them across the floor. Ethan immediately bent to help gather them, his small hands reaching for the papers, but one of the men smirked and kicked a sheet just out of his reach. "Careful, kid," he said mockingly. "Wouldn't want you to mess up the important work around here." Ruth straightened, her jaw tight. She met the man's eyes with steady calm. "Respect costs nothing," she said softly, gathering the last paper and setting it neatly on the counter. "Try it sometime." The men scoffed and left, muttering about special treatment as they disappeared down the hall. Ethan looked up at his mother, his face flushed with frustration. "Why do they talk like that, Mama? Why don't you tell Mr. Grant?" Ruth knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her son's forehead. "Because, Ethan, silence can sometimes be stronger than shouting. But we don't let their words change who we are. We do our work with honor, and that will speak for us when the time is right." What she did not know was that Alexander had seen the entire incident on his surveillance feed. He had watched Ruth's composure, Ethan's restraint, and the mockery of employees who thought themselves untouchable. Each new recording Marcus received became another piece of a growing puzzle, and every piece pointed to the same truth. The rot Richard represented was spreading through the company's veins. Marcus Chen had begun pulling at threads. He tracked suspicious expense accounts, traced contracts that seemed inflated, and followed trails of money that disappeared into shell companies. What he discovered confirmed what Alexander had long suspected. Richard's arrogance was not limited to words. He had been siphoning funds, covering losses by burying them in obscure budgets, and using his authority to silence anyone who dared question him. The evidence was damning, but Marcus knew it had to be airtight. "This is deeper than a personal vendetta," Marcus said one evening as he spread documents across Alexander's desk. "Richard has built a network. He's been paying off mid-level managers to look the other way, creating a culture of fear. If we bring him down, others will fall with him. It won't just be a scandal, it will shake the foundation of Grant Enterprises. Alexander studied the documents, his face unreadable. Then let it shake, he said finally. An empire that protects corruption is not worth keeping. I will not allow my company to become a monument to fear. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious. Understand this, Alexander. The moment we move against Richard, he will fight back with everything he has. He'll use his family's influence. He'll spread rumors. He'll try to turn the board against you, and he won't hesitate to drag Ruth and her son through the mud if it serves his purpose. At that, Alexander's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Ethan's quiet honesty, of Ruth's unwavering dignity, of the moment that had first shaken him, the boy straightening stacks of money with no thought of taking. They had become more than employees in his eyes. They were reminders of the kind of integrity he wanted to rebuild his empire upon. If Richard dared target them, Alexander would not remain silent. The storm broke sooner than expected. At the next board meeting, Richard made his move. He stood before the long table, a confident smile playing at his lips, and presented a series of charts and figures that highlighted unnecessary expenditures. At the top of his list was the janitorial division. "Gentlemen and ladies," Richard said smoothly, "we pride ourselves on efficiency. Yet here we are, rewarding mediocrity. A cleaning woman receives repeated raises without justification. Her child roams our halls like it's a playground. Is this the image we want of Grant Enterprises? Favoritism? Sentimentality? Weakness?" Murmurs rippled around the table. A few nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to voice dissent. Richard turned his gaze toward Alexander, his smile widening. "We must remember, leadership requires hard choices. If we allow emotion to cloud judgment, we undermine the very structure that keeps this empire strong." Alexander's eyes, cold and sharp, locked on Richard. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Alexander leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with steel. "Do you know what undermines an empire, Richard?" he asked quietly. "It's not sentiment. It's arrogance. It's the belief that some people are invisible, that their work is beneath respect, that their dignity can be dismissed. That is the rot that destroys from within." The room went still. Richard's smile faltered, but only for an instant. He quickly recovered, chuckling as though Alexander's words were nothing more than rhetoric. "Beautiful speech, Alexander, but speeches don't balance books." What Richard didn't know was that Marcus had already secured the evidence. Bank records, contracts, internal emails, enough to expose the full extent of his corruption. Alexander remained silent about it for now, choosing his moment carefully. But deep inside, he knew the confrontation was no longer distant. It was here, pressing against the walls, ready to explode. That night, Ruth and Ethan walked through the empty corridors, unaware of the storm raging above them in the boardroom. Ethan carried his notebook, filled with sketches of tall buildings he dreamed of designing one day. Ruth glanced at him, weary but proud. "What are you drawing now, Ethan?" "A building," he said, his eyes bright. "But not just any building. One where everyone has windows, Mama. Even the people in the basement. No one should be in the dark." Ruth's throat tightened, but she smiled. "Then build it, my son. Build it one day." Upstairs, Alexander closed the final folder Marcus had given him. His decision was made. The time for observation was over. The time for action had come. And as the storm outside lashed against the tall windows of his mansion, he whispered the words that had carried him this far. "If justice can begin with how a child handles money, then justice must also decide who holds power." The storm had broken, and when the dawn came, nothing would be the same again. The Reckoning. The storm that had been building inside Grant Enterprises finally reached its breaking point on a gray Monday morning when the board assembled in the highest tower of the company's headquarters. The air inside the conference room was heavy with anticipation. Every director sensed that the meeting was going to be different. that beneath the formal agenda, something deeper was about to unfold. Alexander Grant entered with his usual calm authority, but his silence carried a weight that made even seasoned executives glance uneasily at one another. He was not a man prone to hesitation. When he sat at the head of the long mahogany table, it was clear to all that he had come not to debate, but to deliver judgment. Richard Blackwell, on the other hand, radiated confidence. Dressed immaculately, his cufflinks gleaming, he greeted the board with the easy charm of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had spent weeks laying the groundwork, whispering doubts about Alexander's leadership, painting Ruth Carter's presence as favoritism, and positioning himself as the voice of practicality against Alexander's supposed sentimentality. Richard was certain today would be the day he secured the upper hand. The meeting began with routine reports, but everyone knew the real confrontation was still ahead. When the time came, Richard stood, his voice smooth as silk. He presented charts, financial breakdowns, and polished arguments, each one crafted to highlight inefficiencies under Alexander's watch. At the heart of his presentation, as always, was Ruth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, pacing slowly before the massive screen, "our company's reputation has been built on discipline, efficiency, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet recently, we've seen exceptions being made, raises granted without justification, allowances for personal matters bleeding into professional spaces, a cleaning woman whose wages continue to rise, a child roaming our halls as though this were a playground. These are not trivial matters. They are signs of weakness. And weakness, as history teaches us, is the first crack in any empire." A murmur rippled through the board. Some nodded reluctantly. Others avoided looking at Alexander. Ruth's name had become a tool, twisted into a symbol of inefficiency and favoritism. Richard's eyes gleamed as he turned to Alexander. "We must ask ourselves," he continued, "whether leadership has lost its clarity, whether emotions are now guiding decisions once governed by reason. If we do not correct course, I fear for the legacy of Grant Enterprises." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then Alexander rose. He did not bring charts or slides. He did not pace the floor. He simply stood, his gaze steady, his voice low but commanding. "Richard," he said, "you speak of legacy as though it is measured only in profit margins and efficiency. But legacy is measured in something greater, in integrity, in the values we leave behind when the money is gone. You call Ruth Carter's raises weakness. I call them recognition of dignity. You call her child a distraction. I call him proof that honesty still exists in this world." Richard laughed softly, shaking his head. "Beautiful words, Alexander, but words do not pay dividends." It was then that Alexander gave a small nod. The doors to the conference room opened, and Marcus Chen entered, carrying a thick folder. The room stirred. Few outside Alexander's closest circle knew Marcus, but those who did recognized the man who had once dismantled embezzlement rings for federal agencies. He set the folder on the table, his expression calm, his voice precise. "I've been conducting an investigation," Marcus said, "at Mr. Grant's request. What I found is not weakness, it's corruption." He opened the folder and began to lay out documents. Bank records showing funds siphoned into shell accounts, contracts inflated far beyond their value, emails in which Richard threatened managers who questioned discrepancies. Every piece of evidence was meticulous, undeniable, damning. The boardroom fell silent as the weight of the truth pressed down. Richard's face, once smug, drained of color. He tried to interrupt, but Marcus's voice cut through, steady and relentless. "To silence dissent. Mr. Blackwell has not only betrayed this company, he has betrayed every employee who trusted its integrity." Alexander stepped forward then, his voice carrying the final blow. "Richard, you accused a mother and her son of being symbols of weakness. But it is you who has weakened us by turning greed into policy, by using fear to maintain control. This empire will not be built on rot, not while I still draw breath." The silence was absolute. Every eye in the room was fixed on Richard, who sputtered, searching for words. "This is absurd, fabricated." "Absurd?" Marcus interjected. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why funds from our medical benefits account ended up in a company registered under your cousin's name." Richard froze. The room exhaled collectively, the sound of certainty settling into the air. The board no longer looked at him with deference. They looked at him with betrayal. In the weeks that followed, the reckoning unfolded swiftly. Richard was suspended, then formally charged as Marcus's findings were turned over to regulators. His allies scattered, unwilling to sync with him. The empire he thought he controlled crumbled overnight, not from external enemies, but from the weight of his own corruption. Through it all, Ruth continued her work. She did not gloat, did not seek attention. When reporters tried to corner her, she simply said, "I only did my job." Ethan, however, watched everything with wide eyes, his understanding of justice deepening with each passing day. Alexander, meanwhile, felt something within himself shift permanently. For years he had believed leadership meant control, meant guarding himself from disappointment, meant never showing vulnerability. But standing in that boardroom, defending Ruth and Ethan, he realized leadership meant something else entirely, the courage to defend what was right, even when it cost you everything. One evening, after the storm had begun to settle, Alexander walked down the hall where Ruth was cleaning. Ethan sat nearby with his notebook, sketching buildings again. Alexander paused, watching them for a long moment before speaking. "Ethan," he said gently, "what are you drawing this time?" The boy looked up, his eyes bright. "A tower," he said, "but this one is different. It has big windows for everyone, even the people at the bottom." Alexander smiled faintly, his throat tight. "Then perhaps one day you'll build it, and when you do, remember this. An empire is not measured by how tall it stands, but by how well it shelters those inside." Ruth glanced at him, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. In that moment, Alexander knew the reckoning was not just about Richard, it was about himself. He had been tested just as surely as Ethan had been in front of the open safe. And because of a boy's honesty, because of a mother's strength, he had found the courage to pass his own test. The reckoning had come, and from it, something new was being born. Legacy of Integrity. The downfall of Richard Blackwell shook Grant Enterprises like an earthquake. For weeks, headlines blazed across financial journals and news networks. Vice President exposed in corruption scandal. Grant Enterprises cleans house. Billionaire CEO sides with Maid against boardroom giant. Reporters tried to spin the story as sensational, a tale of betrayal at the top. But within the walls of the company, the truth ran deeper. It wasn't just a story about corruption, it was a story about a child's honesty, a mother's dignity, and a billionaire who rediscovered the meaning of integrity. For Ruth, the storm passed quietly. She continued to clean the halls, her cart rattling softly across the marble floors as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. Colleagues who once ignored her now greeted her with hesitant respect. Supervisors who once nitpicked her work now gave her space, their eyes lowered in silent acknowledgement of the injustice she had endured. Ruth herself did not demand recognition. She believed dignity was not in the applause of others, but in remaining true to one's values when no one was watching. Ethan, however, noticed everything. His young mind absorbed the shift in the atmosphere. He saw how people looked at his mother differently, how whispers had turned from ridicule to reluctant admiration. More than once he overheard someone mutter, "That's the woman the boss defended." He didn't always understand the politics behind it, but he understood this. His mother had never bent, never wavered, even when others tried to make her feel small. That, he realized, was what true strength looked like. Alexander Grant, meanwhile, became a different man in the eyes of the world. To the public, he was hailed as a rare kind of leader, a billionaire who had chosen principle over convenience. Some investors questioned his judgment, worried that his focus on values would soften the company's edge. But others rallied to him, believing that integrity could be the foundation of something stronger than fear. For Alexander himself, the opinions mattered less than the quiet certainty in his own heart. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace with his decisions. The weeks turned into months, and the company began to transform. Alexander ordered sweeping reforms, new codes of conduct that elevated dignity in the workplace, whistleblower protections for those who spoke out against corruption, scholarships and mentorships for employees. CDB. Hildren. It was not charity, it was culture. He wanted Grant Enterprises to be known not just for profits, but for the values it stood upon. Ruth's name never appeared in the press releases. Alexander ensured she was shielded from the spotlight, her privacy intact. But within the company, her quiet example became legend. Executives referenced her in private conversations, reminding one another that leadership was not about titles, but about integrity lived out in the smallest acts. Ethan, too, became a symbol. Alexander quietly arranged for him to have access to the company's library, where shelves of books stood waiting for curious minds. He also ensured Ethan had mentors in fields that matched his interests: architecture, engineering, finance. The boy, who once sat in corners with a worn notebook, now had tools to dream bigger, and he dreamed not of wealth for its own sake, but of a future where, as he once told his mother, everyone has windows, even the people at the bottom. One evening, several months after Richard's removal, Alexander invited Ruth and Ethan to his mansion, not as employees, but as guests. Ruth was hesitant, unused to such settings, but Alexander insisted. When they arrived, the billionaire greeted them at the door himself, no staff in sight. "Mrs. Carter, Ethan," he said with a warmth few had ever heard in his voice, "tonight, you are not here to work. You are here because I want to thank you." Ruth lowered her gaze respectfully. "Sir, I only did my job." Alexander shook his head. "No, you did more. You reminded me what this company and what I should stand for, and your son." He turned to Ethan, who clutched his notebook nervously. "You reminded me that honesty is not a relic of the past. It is alive, if we are willing to see it." Ethan's eyes widened, his small voice breaking the silence. "But I didn't do anything special. I just fixed what?" "It was messy." Alexander smiled faintly. "Exactly. You did the right thing when no one was watching. That is the rarest thing of all." The dinner that followed was simple, not extravagant. Alexander asked Ethan about his drawings, listened as the boy described his dream buildings, and even encouraged him to sketch at the table. Ruth watched quietly, her heart swelling with both pride and disbelief. Never in her life had she imagined sitting at the same table as the billionaire she once thought untouchable. Yet here she was, not as a maid, but as a guest, her dignity intact. After that evening, Alexander made a decision that would define his legacy. He created the Integrity Foundation, a trust funded by his own fortune, designed to provide scholarships, mentorships, and opportunities for children of working-class families. The motto he chose came directly from Ethan's innocent words: "Fix what is messy, build what is better." The foundation quickly became one of the most respected initiatives in the nation, not because of its wealth, but because of its authenticity. People sensed it was born not from public relations strategy, but from a genuine story of a boy, his mother, and a billionaire who chose to listen. Years later, when Ethan stood on a stage as a young man, receiving the foundation's first full scholarship to study architecture, he looked into the crowd and saw his mother beaming with pride, and Alexander Grant watching with quiet satisfaction. In his speech, Ethan said words that echoed far beyond the hall. "My mother taught me that integrity is fixing what's messy, even when no one thanks you. Mr. Grant taught me that leadership is protecting what's right, even when it costs you. Because of them, I will build, not just buildings, but a life where everyone has light." The audience rose in applause, many with tears in their eyes. Alexander, who had once doubted whether honesty still existed in the world, felt something he had not felt in decades. Certainty that he had left behind more than wealth. He had left behind a legacy of integrity. As he stood in the back of the hall, away from the cameras, Alexander whispered words meant only for himself. If justice can begin with how a child handles money, then let my justice be measured by how I handled that child's future. The journey that had begun with a test, a billionaire pretending to sleep, a safe left open, a boy with small hands and pink gloves, had ended with something far greater than any fortune. It had ended with hope restored, dignity defended, and a new legacy written not in contracts, but in hearts.